Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to prompt some intros with our guests today. So, James and Lindsey, if you could let us know your name, your job title, and where you're from, we can start there. And then we'll get into some of the questions you asked today and a few themes our listeners can expect us to touch on. This episode will be about building comfort in the classroom, strategies for educators, and how to work with parents. So, James, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure of mine to be here. This really is exciting. My name is James Fierst. I am the head of upper school for grades 5 through 8 at Woodland Country Day School. We're a private elementary school in Bridgeton, New Jersey, South Jersey, for those on the East Coast. And I've been here at the school for 24 years. It's been an exciting process to see so many of my students from preschool all the way through 8th grade. And, currently our one student that we are working with right now with Selective Mutism, I've known her since she was in preschool and she's now in 5th grade. And we're watching a wonderful growth in her this year. So I just had some questions that as a non-special education educator, I want to make sure that I'm getting some answers that I can help my teacher team with as we're working with our student.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Lindsey?
Hi, I'm Lindsey Reckelberg. I'm a school social worker with Denmark School District, which is a very small rural school outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I have been working with some students with selective mutism. And so I've been listening to unspoken words myself and using a lot of your resources to help teachers and educators how to meet the needs of these students.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
Thank you. So I'm going to prompt one of James's questions first, and I'll let you elaborate, James. But I think this
Sure.
is a great question to start with, as it is a building block type of question. So it goes, what are some signs to look for to determine if the child is stressed or anxious, and how do we help them? So, James, if you want to add a little bit more to why you submitted that question.
Sure. It really came about at the beginning of this year because for my division, for 5th through 8th grade, our students coming to us are experiencing a very different change in their day-to-day life in school here. We're in a whole different building than they were when they were in 1st through 4th grade. We moved classes, so they aren't with just one teacher all day like they had been since they were in 4th grade. And there's a lot more responsibility on the students. At the beginning of the year, our student she had just spent the summer and the later part of last year working with the smart sensor and, going through different therapy and working out things. But the beginning of the school year was very difficult for her. There were mornings where she wouldn't get out of the car. She was fully dressed in her uniform, but she wouldn't get out of the car. And we, as a team of teachers, came together to just start getting her, can you just come in and be with the class for homeroom period? Can you be with us for maybe 2 periods in the morning? And slowly over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks, we were able to get her to the point that she felt confident enough to say goodbye to dad in the morning and come into school and be with us for the full school day. We were knowledgeable that we needed to find those milestones for her and to make sure that we weren't just saying, no, just suck it up. You got to go to school. You got to do this all day long. We were working with her on that. But with a student like her and not being vocal about her feelings all the time, that was a concern that a lot of my teachers had where, we see this very blank stare on her throughout the day. And yes, she's getting work done. She's doing work, but is she stressed? Is she anxious? And what can we do to try to identify that without putting her on the spot?
Great question. Jen, you want to start? I saw you nodding.
Well, I was nodding because there's so many things that even before answering your question that I have to say kudos to you and your team, because coming from the elementary school age and then transitioning to a new school, a new building, the routine is different. Transitions can be so hard for so many of our kids. And so that's a big transition, new building, new routines, changing classrooms. And so we've already gone from K through 4th, maybe in the same building and a similar routine. And now we're switching gears. That can be very challenging for some of our kids. So the fact that she went from not being able to get out of the car to coming into the building, kudos to your team for meeting her where she was and building that comfort. I think a lot of our kids and many of our parents and listeners could say they've experienced that with their kids at time to time. And what you said, James, was great, which is instead of like, suck it up, we have just to get in there and we can't just drag them in or hoist them over our shoulder and bring them in. Not our 5th through 8th graders anyway. Those pieces of finding how do we create less expectation and and create smaller, manageable amounts for them to handle is so important. So things that you said, I just want to point out to our listeners that were so great. And some might be saying, well, wait, James, how did you even get your student to transition in? I think it's important to note that sometimes having our goal may not be the whole day, but a certain part of the day. If it's just homeroom, then that's our starting point. For some kids, it's, I can't even make it into the homeroom classroom. I might meet my counselor, my social worker, a comfortable point person before I even make it into the building. Or instead of walking in by themselves, we're really big on giving them a lot of warm-up time and preparation. Come into school early so they're not walking in with the whole crowd, but they're coming in ahead of time. They have maybe a task or a certain landing zone to come to first before they even go into their classroom, and maybe they go in with a peer or a trusted adult. Those are all those things that help them move in and build it out little by little. And I think the other piece that sort of came to me right away when you talked about comfort was, we always ask the question, well, why? Why do so many of our kids, have selective mutism? What's sort of those underlying contributing factors? And some of our kids are very timid, and that can be a piece, but some have sensory sensitivities. So getting out of the car and moving into the building where there's a lot of people, a lot of noise, larger crowds can be really challenging too. And so those little ways of breaking down the large group and the big overwhelm into come early, meet with a point person, and break down the day really helps them to move into the space, because that's then when we could say, now that they're in the space, now how do we view their presentation? So just kudos to the leaning in part before we even get to the presentation part. So I just wanted to comment on that, and that was why my head was shaking so much.
Well, again, great, because it sounds like this child felt safe. And I think that's a really key part here. Is you mentioned you are an educator in the 5th to 8th grade. And for all age children, we really want their involvement, their proactiveness in this. So one thing I recommend for all kids is their awareness to this, trusting how they feel. We use feelings charts a lot, and we work with them in a collaborative way for them to start to also plan what they're comfortable with us guiding them. So often parents and teachers are like, you need to do this, you should do that. And it doesn't sound like you did that, which is great, because I often say, let's rid you should and you need to from the vocabulary versus, hey, this seems really hard, this seems really scary, let's work together, here's some ideas. So that way, it really gives them a sense of control, because as we know, when we're anxious, we feel out of control. So their awareness to this is really, really key too. And starting out, like you said, slow, to kind of lean into the question of signs to look for in a student. You're mentioning more of a typical presentation, an avoidant presentation, kind of the deer in the headlights, flat affect. But some kids will act out when they have anxiety. So they'll go the other extreme. There'll be a behavioral difficulty. They may be very disruptive. So there's all different presentations for anxiety. And I think that's important. We often think kids with selective mutism are pretty shut down and that deer in the headlight flat affect. And that's a body language that's typical. But we also have to think about their avoidance, whether they're complete avoidance of they look comfortable, but they're just avoiding a situation, or they're acting out. So those are signs of anxiety that we can kind of relate to kind of generalize this.
Yeah, and one of the other pieces, James, that you mentioned was, well, how do we not draw attention to your student or any student in the classroom, where if they're not telling us, because if our child is in stage 1 on the social communication bridge, which is the nonverbal stage, well, how do we know? And as Dr. E mentioned, there's one piece, which is, working through like a feelings chart, and we do a lot of recognition of feelings. Now, would we break that out in the middle of the classroom? No, not necessarily. However, that is one piece, though, of working with a teacher that we feel safe and comfortable with, or a point person, whether it's a counselor, to have a better understanding of what is the best way to approach this student. So for some students, it might mean we keep a journal throughout the day and we check back and forth with the journal, and that child can sort of note how they're doing, how they're feeling. It could be a sticky note. Some kids are comfortable with that. The older our kids get, they don't want as much attention on them. So doing it, one-on-one, off to the side where they can access a journal or some way to write down how they're doing. Also, the other piece too to this is when our kids are in the classroom classroom setting. Dr. E and myself, there's a phrase that we use all the time when we're helping parents or professionals, which is look, listen, and learn. And so in the classroom, when do we see that this child looks a little more anxious than not, or looks uncomfortable, and what does that discomfort look like? And as Dr. E said, we need to know what we're looking at. Are we looking at a child who is having that flat stare and they're frozen? Are they having that fight response where they're up and moving and, avoidant of something? And when do we see it? And so if we know when we see it, that helps us to better regulate, one, bringing it to their awareness. I noticed that when we move in, we transition, between classes, that may seem like a really hard time, for that student, and bringing them into the conversation of what might we need during that time. And again, there are kids, I feel like, as we get into the older grades too, if we have that relationship and bond, if a teacher's walking the room and checking in, even just walking by and letting them know, I might check on you. And so it might just be, I like tap the desk or just put my hand on your desk and look over and give you a nod. And if you nod back, I know we're doing okay. And we might use a hand signal. So there are subtle ways to bring them into awareness of, I'm checking in on you, and a nonverbal could be a response they give, or could be away from the group in a journal or some other, private way that point person develops with them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm so proud of the team of teachers in my division and how we've embraced her and worked with her and listened to the teachers like myself who have actually known her since she was in preschool, and watching her growth over the years. We've seen huge improvements since September of her not getting out of the car and now being a part of the community, participating in class, even if it is in 1 or 2 word answers. These are huge milestones that us and the parents together are really working towards. And it's a blessing to know that we have such supportive parents, but also the supportive team that we have in place here in the school.
That's great.
Lindsey, do you have any comments or feedback about the question that James had proposed and anything that Dr. E or Jen said?
Going into my question is the idea of that point person and who that is for a child. Because with one of my students, I would like to think I am the point person. I have the longest relationship with her, but although she is now talking to her teacher, she's now talking to peers, she's still completely silent for me. She will laugh around me. She will whisper to a friend, and that whisper will be audible. But I think where my question is, it's, in reading all up on your website, it's like, well, what the heck? I'm confused. Like, shouldn't I be that person for her?
Well, you mentioned you've known this child for a while, right?
About a year. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so sometimes this happens where if the child met you when that child was mute, they still see you that way.
Really?
So, yes. If she's verbal with, let's say, the teacher or some peers, a great thing you can do is, one, first of all, how old is this student?
6.
Okay, so it's a little one. So it depends on how much you kind of talk to her about this. And like we have 6-year-olds at Communicamp, that 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds that are learning the bridge and where they are on the bridge. Again, it's all about giving them control, and it's not about focusing on talking. So we will talk to them and teach them the bridge so they know where they are on the bridge, whether they're pointing, they're nodding, whether they're using sounds. A 6-year-old is perfect, phonetics, whether they're using a peer, a friend as an intermediary, a teacher as an intermediary. Do you want red or blue? No answer, red or blue. Tell Mrs. Smith. So in other words, they start to think about where they are on the bridge. Okay. One of the recommendations that we would have is that I would be interacting with peers with her and playing some games and activities that involve either using a peer as an intermediary, some general competition, some fun interest activities where you could ask some choice, direct questions using these visuals, avoiding direct eye contact, because sometimes when we look at the children, we increase their expectation. And you can prompt the intermediary. Do you want red or blue? No answer, red or blue, tell Rebecca. And then repeat with that eye contact. That's a really, really basic, easy strategy. And avoid saying, can you? Instead of can you tell Rebecca, just say it very directly and then begin to repeat with that eye contact. That's the most basic way to use the intermediary. Also, she's 6. Use sounds, use phonetics, sounding out. And you might be surprised, cat, fun use of songs and fun use of sounds. And all of a sudden she's answering basic 1 or 2 words or just saying one word. And from saying one word, cat, all of a sudden it's the cat. And so that would be a kind of great way to segue with you, whether it's talking to her about this and involving the teacher and or peers. And if she is the most comfortable in her classroom rather than your room, perhaps meeting in the classroom when there's not many people around, and what we call the spot, the section away from the group, a lunch bunch, a friendship group, either in the room or even in your room. I think those are great ideas. Jen, do you have any other feedback?
You just rattle them off.
Sure. You know me. You know how I get it.
I love it. And Lindsey, all the things Dr. E is mentioning are right on par. So we sometimes think that if I've been meeting with this child so frequently from the very beginning, yes, doesn't that qualify me? I'm that person. You should make the most progress with me. And when they start to make progress with others, one, it personally can feel like, man, what am I not doing right here? Right. So one, it's not personal, but I will say, as Dr. E mentioned, sometimes that first meeting is meeting them in a place where they cognitively see themselves as mute. And so the fact that you've known her for so long, it's, Dr. E always mentions, it's like a mountain out of a molehill. The longer I go without using my words in your presence, now the bigger it is that I don't use my words in your presence. So some kids, now not all, and depending on the age, may feel like, well, now if I do speak, in front of this teacher, this staff person, now it's a big deal because I haven't yet. So it's just harder to step into that next stage. So as Dr. E mentioned, the first thing I was going to say is, wow, she's verbalizing, or he is verbalizing with the teacher and also with a student. That means that you have what I refer to as like two verbal anchors. You've got two people that we've got some consistent verbalization with, or categories of people. Could be more than one student. When we pull into a one-on-one, although it is better to have small group or one-on-one time with our students, because we always say, progress rarely happens in the larger group in front of a large group of people. We really have to make it comfortable and move off to the side where it's one-on-one or small group, because that's where we can really progress communication. But sometimes, depending on a child's presentation, and that's really important because not all kids with SM have the same presentation. And so this student may feel like when it's just me and you, I feel a bigger weight, a bigger sense of expectation that all eyes are on me and I have to perform or progress or what have you. And when they're with a peer, they're sharing that attention. Or when their teacher's there, they have someone else to share that social limelight with, and that makes it a little easier to come into communication. So if you do have the teacher or a peer, yes, I sometimes with my lunch bunch groups, which is just, lunchtime once or twice a week, you come to my office, let's say, and you're doing lunch, with me and another peer. And maybe that's what I'm recommending to some of my school providers. That's a great opportunity to play games and do communication tasks where you can facilitate what Dr. E said, which is the use of a verbal intermediary. So lots of games. If your student just knows everything about the show Bluey or everything about SpongeBob or, loves certain trivia about certain characters, that's a great way to say, we're going to do a trivia game. And you both or the three of you are partners, and I'm going to ask questions. So if this child knows everything about, Bluey, we can do things and say, what is Bluey's sibling's name? And giving a choice and saying, great, tell Rebecca, Rebecca will tell me. And that child might in front of you be able to turn and tell, like you said, they'll tell someone else the answer and it's audible. Yeah. And so if she audibly, gives the answer and you hear it, instead of what some teachers and professionals do is they ignore what they heard because they don't want to draw attention to it. But what we're saying is, you don't want to have a big party and say, I heard you, you told Rebecca, but I heard you, and make a big fuss about it. But as Dr. E mentioned, just simply repeating the answer back and saying, oh, yep, that's her name. Great answer. Next question, and moving on. You've confirmed it, you've repeated it, and you are subtly letting the student know I was heard without the big fuss, without the big to-do. And that helps our kids to regulate through that idea of what if everyone hears me and they make a big deal, because you are hearing it and no big deal happened. And that can sometimes soften that, bringing you into conversation. It feels easier. And the more we do that, I like to say lightning round questions, lots of questions in a row, not just one, because we need more frequency of asking questions. So that's whether we're doing it with a teacher, whether we're doing it with a friend, that's a really great way. And as Dr. E mentioned, your office versus the classroom. really great ways to look at that. And Dr. E mentioned sounds, and sounds are a fun way. I love doing sound work with our young kids because there's so many great ways to use fun sounds in gentle competition and in silly activities. So even by what we sometimes say is, I might say, well, we're using straws, and at the end of the straw, we've got 2 feathers, and we're going to blow the feathers across the finish line down the table to see who can get there the fastest. And as the kids are making that sound, that's moving them into stage 2 on the bridge, because any utterances or sounds are the beginning of moving into stage 2. Can we start there and then pull them back and say, now I'm going to ask you some fun yes no questions? If the answer is yes, blow the feather, and they do. And then it's asking some questions where maybe we begin with some letter sounds and we start to put them together, but we're doing it together as a team. They could do it chorally without that child feeling called out. But you have 2 really great options in stage 2, which is sound work and verbal intermediary work, by using the teacher or peer to help strengthen the communication. Because once you start to confirm her answers or his answers, you are helping this child to move across into stage 3. And that's
I used a lot of stuff that I found on your website, and she brought a unicorn from home that was like her nubby. That was her first verbal intermediary, and I would keep track of, like, she would whisper to it, but I had to be across the room, and then we slowly got there. So like her IEP goals are like pretty much met, but I have the scale of like how scary it is to talk to certain people, and she'll say her teacher is a 0, not scary at all. I'm still a 3. She is still petrified, to talk in front of me. And it's interesting because like her teachers, like, they're ready to dismiss from special, like they're like, she has come light years, like, yay, job well done. And I'm kind of, as part of the IEP team, like, is it a job well done? Because she still won't.
Well, I could add something, Dr. E. Can I just add, the social communication bridge is a tool that the teacher, that the student and you can be using. And just because she is across the bridge with her teacher doesn't mean she's across the bridge with every staff. She is at stage 2 on the bridge with you, and she may not be visually seeing that bridge yet to understand that. But instead of the question of what might it be like to speak to me, it's a 3 on that bridge, we could say, well, sure, because you haven't used your words with me yet. So yes, that can feel scary. What does it feel like when you tell Mrs. Smith the answer, right? And she tells me, or once we start to gauge, what does that feel like? Well, that feels like a 2 or a 1. That's right. As we're using someone as a verbal intermediary. But as you start to confirm her answers, right? Those are also questions we can ask of, how did it feel when we played that trivia game and you told Rebecca the answers? As she's telling Rebecca the answers and we're tracking on the bridge, we could propose and say, well, where were you on the bridge in our session? And she puts it in the middle, I told Rebecca the answers. You could say, you told Rebecca, but many of your answers I got, and you did a great job at that. You're now across the bridge, and we can sometimes begin to show it. Depends on this child's presentation, how quickly we identify that. But sometimes that can help, because if it feels just really hard, sometimes by showing what she is capable of doing, whether with sounds or whether it's with the use of a verbal intermediary, that can begin to show her what she is doing, and she is comfortable doing it at a little less, on the bridge, but we're progressing upward. So that bridge work can be really empowering to our kids. Sorry, Dr. I know you were going to say something.
I like that idea. I do, in terms of advice to other schools, though, I fell into the trap when I first met her. She was in kindergarten, and anytime I heard anything come out of her, whether that was audible anything, I'd give her a tally, and then she could kind of earn to bring a friend in the space with me. And I totally regret that. It seemed like in kindergarten that really motivated her, because she wanted to bring a friend, which obviously in talking with you, she wanted to bring a friend so that she was kind of out of the hot seat. So of course it was motivating. But then the older she got, she didn't like that anymore. I could tell that she didn't like that I was keeping track of that. And I definitely, any advice to other educators, like, it's an easy trap to fall into, because I think in education we are so like,
you are nailing it on the head. And I would say that this is the biggest message we have. Jen and I consult with schools. We spend half our week consulting with schools, the other half with families. And the biggest problem we see is so much focus on speaking without understanding the child at all, the comorbidities that may be affecting them, but also honoring the stages. That's the beauty of the bridge. Look, the kids taught me the bridge early on in my career. I didn't just develop it one day, but realize that we have to respect the stages that they're at as a baseline. and then work from there, bridging up, in smaller smaller situations, and then bridging down in bigger, louder, larger situations, or however we need to do it based on the child. And that's the biggest recommendation is don't focus on speaking. If the child is not speaking, they're telling you something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about where are they?
Come. It'll come. I wish
Yep.
I would have told me that myself. Like, it will come, and it does come. I mean, one question I would like to know is, when a child won't communicate or is not comfortable communicating with somebody, do we just honor that? Because it also feels kind of silly and a little far-fetched to be like that we want her to communicate with everybody, because I think any typical, like, she just might not want to. And when do we honor that is just her being her?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I assume you mean verbal communication, or just all communication?
Verbal. She gets her needs met, but sometimes, like, she doesn't want to talk to our principal or anything like this. Sorry,
So
James.
what if we change the narrative and we changed it from doesn't want to maybe doesn't have a need to in that moment, or doesn't know how?
Okay.
It's almost like we assume that they don't want to, or that. And I just did a school consult recently where the school felt this was all behavioral, all of it. That when the child wants to, he speaks. When the child doesn't want to, just stares at me. And I said, let's just change the narrative here. If the child is not speaking, is it conversation? Hi, how are you? What are you doing this weekend speech? Or is it, do you want red or blue speech over a task, a visual? What we've learned is you want to structure the classroom situation over visuals, whether it's tests they're doing, whether they're writing down something, that it's not eye to eye deep conversation. It's over the task that you're going to get the most progress. So whether they're playing a game, whether you're doing sight words, whether they're in middle school and do you want to study the environment or the government? No answer. Environment or government? Tell Rebecca. More environment or government? Why don't you write that down? We as teachers, educators, and support staff, we need to facilitate the strategies. We can't wait for them to do it. So we don't want to drill it in. You need to, but it's setting it up. So we set up the buddy process. We set up the small groups with the buddies in the room, out of the room. We set it all up, and we educate teachers on how to question, when to question, where to question, and with who to question. And that is the beauty of working with a expert that knows how to set this up for you and help guide you. And that's really, really, really important. And sometimes it's an authority figure. Like if it's a principal or a teacher they rarely see, that could cause that child to feel intimidated. Or in a case of a student recently of mine, a patient of mine, one of the teachers was really loud, really boisterous. It shut this poor little kid down. Mm-hmm. Whereas a different teacher personality, the child just opened up to. And so there's so many factors into this. James, do you have any thoughts on thinking about?
I'm listening intently to everything. It's amazing. But one of my questions actually pairs well with this conversation, because where we found the success for our student is in independent projects. When she is given the opportunity to do an oral report on a book, if she's given the opportunity to do a science slideshow or something like that, without hesitation, ever since the beginning of this school year, she has come through and actually verbally not just put the slideshow up on the board, not just hand the oral report to the teacher. She will get in front of the class, and yes, she's staring at her paper, but how many of our other kids stare at their paper when they're doing a report? And she so eloquently delivers the work that she worked on. And my thing is, what I've been working with my teachers is, let's focus on those successes and figure out where we can harness that energy in other areas so that we can keep having her be a participatory member of the class. Talking with the teacher, talking with her peers. This is something it's been a slow process this year, but we are seeing such growth when she presents these projects. And it's because she is a very thoughtful student. She's a very thoughtful student in her work. She's proud of her work. And without giving, in the beginning of the year, a lot of my teachers were like, would you like to give your report? How do you feel? But now we're at the point like, oh, it's your turn. Let's go. And without actually giving her the opportunity to say, no, I don't want to, she jumps right in and she delivers the project. And it's really exciting to see that part of the mainstreaming that is happening with her being in the rest of the class is really helping her growth.
Can I just say something, James? One of the
Please.
things you said early on is this was one of the very first things that you said was that this student is speaking sometimes like stage 3. So that's one of the stages. I'm not just talking about talking. And that it's a few words. Something that would work well for your student would be write and read and script approach, which it sounds like when you were just talking about the presentation, there's a script approach.
Exactly.
She's the type of student that you can get. I tell this to my students, right? So we have people train with us. I tell this to my students all the time. If you have a verbally responsive client, you can get them to be verbally initiative very quickly. And they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I'm like, have them write it. So if they're able to answer a question through either just even one word or 2 words, you can get them to read, do you like this? Or what is your favorite? Or do you need, see what I mean? You can get them. So during friendship groups, during lunch bunches, during small group activity, them reading directions or asking questions by the write and read is an excellent strategy for your particular student, because I think that's going to work really well.
Yeah, we are super proud of the growth that she's showing, and she wants to be successful. And I see sometimes, when I talked earlier about what are the signs of stress and anxiety in these selective mutism students, the one thing I notice with her, when I look in her eyes, sometimes I feel like she almost can't. That she's at the point where she doesn't know how, especially in the beginning of the year where she couldn't get out of the car. That was an I can't. That's not a I'm choosing not to get out of the car. She's actually in that position where I can't do this. And that was something that our teachers really embraced, to say, and to keep encouraging her. You did, not you can't. You did this. You did this. And trying to just highlight those successes as she's growing throughout this. And again, just such a growth this 1 year in her 5th grade year. It's really remarkable to see.
Oh, James, I love it. I want to piggyback that because I think you're hitting on something that's really hard for many educators, which is what do we do about presentations and how do we help our kids to take on what this student is doing? And that can be very challenging. Or professionals or staff are asking, if they can present in front of the class, then why can't they engage in other social, how come they can't collaborate with peers then? If they can verbalize in front of everyone, why can't they verbalize with everyone? And those are 2 different environments. If you think about, even as our listeners, as adults, as professionals, when you think about presenting something, there is planning, preparing, reviewing it. We go over our questions, we talk through it, we've reviewed our questions. If you are doing a presentation to a group of staff, you have your materials. All of that helps you process better and feel more confident. You feel ready and prepared, right? You become an expert in your presentation. And when you work on something alone, it's so much easier to navigate what I want to create, how I want to put this together. And so all empowerment and control is within you as the developer of, or the creator of your presentation. So when we see kids that can get up in front of a group and present, and that could be for any age or for any child on any stage of the bridge. Some of our kids will get up and present as long as they don't have to speak yet because they're not ready in front of the whole group, but they can get up with their PowerPoint or their poster board and point and show. Some who maybe like Lindsey's student could maybe tell answers to a teacher and the teacher shares it in front of the class as long as the student is up there with them. And then some can take it, and Dr. E keeps mentioning a strategy that's so important, which is write and read. The more I can write it down, have my thoughts prepared, I can then share it. Even if I'm looking down at paper, I know adults who still read off of cue cards and their materials, and they're still verbalizing it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I can verbalize with a whole group. And so as soon as we move into the communicate with others, this is where it gets harder, because now you're talking about social language. And there's a lot of social cues that have to be mastered in that. And so when you're in a group setting, what is my role? Do I have to advocate for myself? Which part am I doing? Here's my idea. All of a sudden, all the control that I'm doing it myself, which is so easy, I have to share ideas and take on a different piece of that and interject and take pause and listen, share ideas. What if I don't want to do it that way? Those are skills that many of our kids, the older they get, they haven't mastered those skills. They haven't had a lot of practice at those. So working in smaller groups to help them to develop, group discussion or pair and share type activity, lab group, lab discussion. As Dr. A mentioned, that's a skill we have to build. And some of that skill can be built out of very structured, facilitated questions. So as a teacher, knowing that this student needs the back and forth with other students, we need to sort of pump that muscle with those students. We can't just throw them in and say, well, you're in the group, figure it out, right? Or join in. But instead it becomes, how do I help this student to be their best, to maneuver out of this barrier with other peers? And that is there task based, that there is some type of Q&A. So end of unit discussion questions. Jen, if I'm that student, Jen, go ahead and read that question to your group. And I might have to come over and help facilitate that and prompt it. And maybe I do with that piece of paper, because you said if they're in control of writing it out, they can read it to the whole class. If they can write it out and read it to their small group, the discussion question is, what was, the percentage of rainfall in, particular place, and they read that, they are verbally now initiating to that group. And the more we can pair of, now other students ask questions and you ask questions back, you're starting to develop that back and forth. And there's so many strategies to build initiation and inserting yourself into communication that need to be built. We sometimes think just because they start to verbalize, they should know how to do those things, but it really is task building in the smaller group and being in a paired group that we build the skill to socialize in a group setting and take it further.
Priceless. Thank you.
James, Lindsey, do you have any final thoughts, any other questions that have popped up before we wrap up the episode?
I don't know. I think this was very rejuvenating just to know that even though she's not talking to me, that there's been a lot of progress, because I think a lot of times we were using the meter stick of her sessions with me as how far she's come. So I like the discussion of just like, she might never talk to me, but that doesn't mean that she's not making a ton of progress.
Yeah, I gotta be honest with you. Just having this conversation today is validation for the work that me and our team have been doing, with our student. And we're fortunate. If you want to make a fortunate statement, we're fortunate that we only have this one student right now with this learning difference, and it's really giving us the opportunity to focus on her and to learn a lot as because we're all growing along with her as she is making her way through, and we're excited to see her progress into 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And I even talked to the parents at the beginning of the year. I said, I can't wait to see us in June in her 8th grade year, graduating from our school and really being, she has all the potential of being a valedictorian or a salutatorian. And that would be extremely exciting for all of us to see that she has made it that place.
Isn't that great? I think there's always things to say. And I think my recommendation to the two of you and also to listeners is that every single child is different. And how this one child for you is presenting, James, and for you, Lindsey, is that child. And although you can take some of these tools and generalize them, it's really about knowing that particular student's unique needs. And that's what I've learned over my entire career, is that there's no two that are exactly the same. So if you're working in verbal intermediary with one child, it might be completely different with another child, even though it sounds verbal intermediary the same. It's about how to tweak it for that child. You have some children wanting help, others that don't want help, some children that have other learning challenges, like literally like processing difficulties, having speech and language difficulties. And how do you adapt those school-based accommodations and interventions? And what I love hearing from both of you is that you really have gotten to know your students. It's not, you didn't once talk about how do we treat selective mutism? How do we develop school-based accommodations for selective mutism? It's this student that you described really, really well. And it's those nuances that really make a difference. And kudos to both of you, because I can see your hearts in it and you really want to understand that student. And as a result, both are doing just so great.
I'll echo that. I think you both have been doing a fantastic job, and thanks for being part of this and asking these questions, because I think in the work, I think especially with Dr. A and I, because we do so many school consultations and trainings, it's not a one-time conversation. It takes walking alongside the student and seeing the pockets of progress. And Lindsey, you're noting that, like, I can't gauge it from just my session. It's look how she's doing in all these other areas. But we don't have to forgo, right, opportunities in your session, it's what strategies do I need to readapt and readjust in my sessions to help her move to the next comfortable place on her bridge. And it may not look like where her teacher is. Where does it need to be with me? What's my next step? And I think those pieces of having for our listeners, for other school professionals, who is your go-to person that you can walk through this process with and ask questions, that when you get to a certain part and you're like, I'm not sure what's next for us, that you have people to work alongside with, to keep moving along, because it's not just a yearly meeting and we'll adjust. It's on a weekly basis. We're seeing growth and progress, and as our kids make progress, what new avenues and strategies can we add? And so that to me is key, that your teams are walking alongside with these students, and it's not a one-time meeting or one-time strategy session.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. So a couple other entries that we had were questions around parents and how to involve parents in the school situation.
Jen, do you want to start?
Well, let me just check with James and Lindsey. Any question around parents that you have had?
Well, I'm not sure if this was right, but she would only talk to her mom in the beginning, so we brought her right in, and me and the mom and the little girl were playing Candyland. So I'm not sure if that's right or wrong, but that's what worked.
I think there's nothing wrong with that, because that's actually part of the process of us getting our student out of the car in the beginning of the year, was just even us getting out of the car and walking towards the front door with the parents and either me or the advocate that has really focused her energies on our student, having us just making those baby steps, if you will, to get acclimated into the process. And then we have a wonderful program of an advisor program within our division, and we're a very small school. We only have 144 students in the entire school, and that's pre-K through 8th grade. So like our student right now is in a class of 5 students. So you talk about one-to-one attention. It's even more than one-to-one attention. And a lot of that, we have constant communication home with the parents, and we work together. It's really remarkable to see the relationship on how that's grown throughout the year too.
Yes, I mean, I think, like you said, involving parents, to me, the majority of children will benefit from having parent involvement if that's a comfort building situation, which in your case, Lindsey, it was, especially when the child was verbal with the parent. You could use that parent as an intermediary. So when we see parents at the Smart Center and we engage the family as a whole, because we never just engage the child, we talk to the family as a whole, I might ask some questions, and then I might say, like, let's say I have a therapy dog at session, and I might say, do you have a dog? And the child nods, and I'll say, is it a girl or a boy? And the child just doesn't know what to do. Let's say, because they're mute in that moment. I might say, is it a boy or a girl? Tell mom. And so I'm prompting the intermediary right away. If the child isn't answering, I give them 5 to 10 seconds to respond, and I'm avoiding eye contact. But you use the parents in ways to facilitate strategies. We have to be careful for the specific student that becomes too dependent on their parent. And too much that parent is in the school, because we've had kids come to us, families come to us, where when the mother's in the school, the child is as loud and boisterous and as chatty as can be. The minute that parent leaves, the child shut down, frozen, stage 0. So there's a fine balance between too much involvement and that child too dependent, and just building comfort and then kind of letting the parent come out, not be there. So for the majority of kids, like having a lunch bunch, if a parent's a good way, or coming in and doing a project, that's fine. But too much tends to backfire.
Yeah, and I will piggyback that and say not all kids do well with a parent present. So that question gets asked a lot during our community camp sessions, and with parents who say, I hear that having a parent present can be really helpful. Should I be asking our school staff if I should come in? And the answer is, well, it depends, and it depends on your child. And so and again, it's also in certain places and times. So when we're, let's say, start of the school year, we're getting to know our new classroom teacher. Is it helpful to have a parent come in a couple times before the school year begins to take a tour of the school, meet the teachers, and have a parent there? Yes, because that can be really comforting to have, parents, parents or relatives that they are close with, or siblings, someone as their point person to come and give them comfort, to help and potentially be that verbal intermediary if they're willing to speak to that parent in that situation. As we move through the school year, pocket. So I usually will point out to parents, when do you think you would be best used? And I give a scenario and say, when you come in, does your child become clingy and then want to leave with you and can't regulate staying, like after you leave? if your child is having a really tough time not separating from you, and behavior changes when you come in, then I usually caution and say, well, we might need to utilize you in very specific times, maybe at the end of the school day, where you come in to do something in the classroom with the teacher versus coming in during the middle of the day where it could be disruptive. If a child is overly dependent on a parent, then my next line is, yes, and we have to make sure it's parent and other students, parent and other teacher, because parents have to be the baton passer, right? Comfort, I'm there to anchor us in, but then I need to pass the baton. And that baton is, how do I bring others into my engagement so that we're building comfort with those individuals and we're transitioning that communication. And for many of our older ones, they don't want their parent coming in because they stand out as different, right? Especially when we get into the upper elementary, middle, definitely high school. Can we still use parents? I have middle school and high school clients that sometimes a parent comes in during selective time for like assessment, important questions where they need to be present, and that can help, be a verbal intermediary when needed. But those students may not feel as comfortable when a parent is present. They would prefer another staff person or a peer as someone they engage with. So it all really depends, but I think parent involvement has a place. And I will say that sometimes Dr. E and I have done school consultations where, one, it's the parents who are asking us to come in and help, be a resource to teachers, but the parents are driving that. But there are also a number of schools that contact us at the Smart Center to say, we're noticing this child is showing signs of selective mutism. We as staff need more guidance. And sometimes the parents aren't as aware that this is a challenge, or they see it as it's a school issue. This child is fine outside of school and every other area. It's just school. So it's not really where they partner. So I think, what is the parent role? I think educating of, when we think about selective mutism is that it's selective, select people, places, pockets of places, and parents need to be educated about what that is and what this looks like in the school. Some parents are not aware of how their child is doing in school. They're not aware that they're not speaking or communicating consistently. And I think those are some important pieces that we need to provide education, and also find what are the correct places to plug in for parents. Where are they going to be best used?
Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to give a huge shout out to James and Lindsey, our participants, for this episode. We're really excited to do more installations like these. Dr. E, any final words?
No, I thank you. Your questions were great. Your insight was great. And I just had such a wonderful time. So thank you for this opportunity for us to be able to share our knowledge and help you and help our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
that was
you.
fast. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.